In today's video, we'll be looking at the terrifying last minutes of people mauled by chimpanzees. From a trainer attacked on a studio set to a tourist dragged down along a forest highway, these stories show how quickly control can collapse. But first, in Chicago, a routine school trip turned deadly. It was April 17th, 2015, just outside Chicago, Illinois. The afternoon was bright and warm as yellow school buses pulled into the parking lot of a small private animal park, a roadside zoo with fading paint on its signs and rust showing through its old fences. Families with strollers mixed with school groups carrying packed lunches. Teachers with clipboards tried to keep order as students pointed at parrots, goats, and monkeys in cramped pens. The chimpanzee exhibit sat near the middle of the park, behind a low chain-link railing and a shallow moat lined with algae. A hand-painted sign read, "No climbing or leaning on fence." Inside the enclosure, 2 adult males and 1 younger female lived together among wooden climbing structures and a patch of worn grass. The walls were streaked with moisture stains, and the enclosure looked outdated compared to the modern habitats seen in larger accredited zoos. Matthew Collins was 12 years old, a 6th grader from a public school on a spring field trip. His mother worked night shifts as a nurse, and his father operated a forklift at a local warehouse. They didn't travel much, but Matthew loved animals and never missed a chance to see them up close. His teachers described him as bright but impulsive, a boy who liked to climb trees, rooftops, or anything taller than himself. At the park, he carried a second-hand digital camera he'd saved for by helping neighbors mow lawns. His plan was simple: get the best photos of the chimps out of anyone in his class. By mid-afternoon, the group gathered near the chimp enclosure. The air smelled of hay, damp earth, and the sour trace of leftover feed. The students crowded against the metal barrier, talking and laughing while their teacher gave instructions. Matthew, standing near the back, raised his camera but couldn't get a clear view past the others. Wanting a better angle, he stepped onto the lower rail for balance as a few classmates noticed and motioned for him to stop. He ignored them, focused on his shot, and leaned forward. The railing was slick with humidity, and the ledge beneath his shoe gave slightly. As he leaned forward to center the chimps in frame, his foot slipped. A few students gasped as his arms windmilled for balance. Then he dropped over the rail and into the pit below. He landed hard on his right side, rolling onto his stomach with a groan. From above, teachers screamed his name. A few kids started crying. For a moment, the enclosure was silent except for the soft panting of the chimps. Then one of the males, an older, broad-shouldered chimp named Bo, stood upright, bristling with tension. He gave a sharp hoot, slapped the dirt, and started toward the boy. The younger male followed, puffing air through his lips in short bursts. Visitors who were close enough later said the sounds were chilling, deep hoots that rose in pitch, the rhythmic drumming of palms on the ground. The 2 chimps stopped about 10 feet away, heads tilted, eyes fixed on the strange figure that had dropped into their space. Bo took 2 quick steps forward and grabbed a fistful of Matthew's shirt. Matthew screamed and tried to crawl backward, but the chimp's grip was iron. Bo's first strike wasn't a feeding bite, it was a dominance blow, a sharp smack to the side of the head that knocked the boy sideways. Then came the bite, a hard, fast clamp on the arm near the wrist. The smaller male joined in from the other side, pulling at the boy's sleeve and striking his shoulder. The sounds of hitting and tearing mixed with hoots and panicked screams from above. A zookeeper stationed near a nearby enclosure heard the commotion and ran toward the enclosure, shouting for the crowd to move back. He grabbed a hose from the maintenance shed and sprayed into the pit, the high-pressure stream breaking the chimp's focus for seconds at a time. Bo let go, slapped the ground, and charged forward again, stopping inches from the water spray. The younger male backed away, pacing in circles while pant-hooting. For nearly half a minute, the 2 chimps alternated between lunging and retreating as keepers threw fruit and banged metal poles against the barrier to draw them off. Eventually, Bo released his grip on the torn fabric of Matthew's shirt and retreated toward the back wall, hooting loudly as he went. Staff rushed in with stretchers the moment the animals were secured in their holding cages. Matthew lay face up, motionless except for shallow breaths. His right arm was badly lacerated, with deep puncture wounds near the elbow and wrist. There were facial injuries consistent with blunt force strikes and a bite near his cheekbone. Paramedics worked to stabilize him, but he went into cardiac arrest before they reached the hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival, his injuries too severe from blood loss and trauma. Authorities launched an investigation within hours. Inspectors found the barrier around the enclosure didn't meet state standards for height or secondary containment. The park, already cited twice in previous years for safety violations, lacked a formal emergency response team. Officials determined that a combination of poor infrastructure and human error had allowed the accident to turn fatal. In the following week, grief counselors visited Matthew's school. Several students who had witnessed the fall reported nightmares and panic at loud noises. The animal park temporarily closed the chimp exhibit, promising stronger barriers and clearer supervision protocols. The tragedy in Chicago showed how a public setting with barriers still failed to protect a child. But the danger doesn't always wait behind fences. Sometimes it lives inside the house, dressed as family, until the day it can't be controlled. It was June 11th, 2014, in Stamford, Connecticut. The afternoon was quiet except for the sound of lawnmowers and cars passing through the neighborhood. Houses lined Rockledge Drive in neat rows, each with trimmed lawns and small front porches. Inside one of these homes, a woman was about to face an attack that would shock the entire community. The house looked ordinary from the outside, but what lived inside made it different from every other home on the block. Belinda Holmes was 57 years old and had lived in Stamford most of her life. She worked part-time at an insurance office, but was better known to neighbors for keeping an unusual companion. She owned a male chimpanzee named Charlie. Belinda had gotten Charlie as an infant years earlier, ignoring state laws that banned private ownership of such animals. She raised him like a child, dressing him in clothes, feeding him at the table, and driving him around in her car. Friends said she was devoted to him and believed she could control him the way others controlled pets. For years, Charlie was a local spectacle. Children stared when he looked out the windows. Neighbors watched Belinda walk him on a leash through the yard. She treated him like family and defended him whenever anyone expressed concern. But there were warning signs. Charlie had grown much larger over the years. By age 12, he weighed over 120 pounds. Belinda struggled to hold him back when he became upset, but she insisted he was gentle and misunderstood. The house showed years of living with the animal. Furniture was scratched and damaged from his climbing. The air often smelled of animal musk. Charlie moved freely through the rooms, from the kitchen to the living room, to the small backyard. On this June day, the weather was warm and the windows were open. Charlie grew restless, pacing and making noise as Belinda tried to calm him with fruit and snacks. Years of living in a human household had not removed Charlie's natural instincts. When stressed or frustrated, a chimpanzee's aggression can surface suddenly, with violence that no amount of familiarity can prevent. There had been warnings before. Months earlier, a neighbor called animal control after Charlie escaped into the yard. He chased cars and pounded on a vehicle before Belinda brought him back inside. State officials reminded her that owning him was illegal, but she ignored the fines. Friends noticed that Charlie became irritable around strangers, but Belinda continued to insist he was harmless. On the afternoon of June 11th, his agitation was clear. He banged on the table, knocked over a chair, and showed his teeth. Belinda moved closer to grab his arm. The attack started in seconds. Charlie lunged forward and slammed Belinda backward into the couch. His hands gripped her shoulders, and his teeth sank into her face with terrible force. Neighbors heard the noise through the open windows. Furniture crashed, and Belinda screamed. Charlie bit again, tearing into her hands as she tried to protect herself. Blood pooled quickly across the carpet as he continued the assault with relentless strength. Belinda tried to crawl away, but Charlie dragged her back by her clothes. He hit her with his fists, then bit into her forearm and broke the bone. Her screams brought neighbors running to the house. One man tried the door but stopped when he looked through the window. Charlie was hunched over Belinda, his face and arms covered in blood. The neighbors backed away and called 911, their voices shaking as they described what was happening. Police arrived within minutes. Officers walking toward the front door heard the chimp screeching and Belinda crying. Through the glass, they saw Charlie attacking, tearing at her scalp and face. There were no cages, no barriers, no way to separate the animal from the victim. When Charlie turned toward the window and pounded against it with bloodied hands, officers decided they had to act. Officers fired multiple shots, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Charlie collapsed in the living room on the blood-stained carpet. Officers rushed inside and pulled Belinda out from under his body. She was barely awake, her face destroyed and her hands mangled. Paramedics worked quickly, but the damage was severe. She was airlifted to a trauma center with critical facial injuries, severe trauma to both hands requiring amputation, and massive blood loss. Afterward, investigators documented the scene. Furniture was flipped over, walls were splattered with blood, and Charlie lay where he had fallen. Belinda's phone was found on the kitchen counter, smeared with blood. The last call she tried to make to 911 was never completed. Neighbors gathered outside, shaken by what they had seen. They told reporters the screams would stay with them forever. Belinda survived, but her life changed completely. She went through multiple surgeries and was left disfigured and needing constant care. The case sparked national attention about the dangers of keeping exotic animals as pets. Connecticut lawmakers passed stricter laws and banned private chimpanzee ownership entirely. The house was eventually sold. The new owners knew the story tied to the property. Belinda believed years of routine made her chimps safe. In Texas, that same illusion spread further. A leash, a crowd, and the idea that wild strength could be managed in a park filled with children. It was May 28, 2017, on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. Along a bend of the Colorado River, a few families had gathered for a Memorial Day barbecue at a privately rented picnic site, a quiet patch of grass bordered by live oaks and open water. Cars were parked along the dirt access road, and children played near the grills while adults unpacked food in folding chairs. The afternoon heat shimmered off the water. Near a cluster of tables by the riverbank, one guest had brought an animal most people only ever saw behind glass. The victim was 36-year-old Daniel Ortiz, a high school track coach who lived a few miles away. He ran the trail most weekends and met friends for cookouts when the weather was clear. Known for his steadiness, Daniel was the kind who brought extra water and sunscreen for anyone who forgot. That day, he had finished a 5-mile loop and stopped by the gathering after a friend texted about the riverside barbecue. He noticed the small crowd near the tables and walked over out of curiosity. Daniel had reasons to feel comfortable around animals. He volunteered at a local shelter and had helped calm anxious dogs before adoption events. He kept a respectful distance, staying behind a low trash can and maintaining space. The chimp wore a harness, and the owner talked with onlookers while handing out small pieces of fruit. Daniel wanted one clear photo to show his students, proof of the strange thing he saw on a normal Sunday. He moved forward a few feet, holding his phone out and angling for a clean shot past the cluster of people. The scene was ordinary in every other way. The chimp shifted constantly, pacing a small circle on the leash, sniffing the air, and reaching toward anything held too close. A thin musk drifted downwind, mixing with charcoal smoke from nearby grills. Adult male chimpanzees are not suited for public gatherings. In social groups, dominance is enforced with sudden violence. Years of human handling do not erase those instincts. Crowds, unfamiliar faces, and food competition can bring them to the surface in seconds. A city ordinance banned exotic animals within Austin limits, but this site lay just beyond municipal oversight. Few people at the event realized the handler lacked the proper permits. A couple near the front stepped back when the chimp bared its teeth at a toddler holding a bright red cup. The owner shortened the leash but kept feeding bits of fruit. A runner passing along the dirt road called out that it looked risky. Daniel nodded, adjusted his stance, and waited for the chimp to settle so he could take one steady shot. The tension increased by inches. Children clustered too close, then were pulled back. The chimp snatched a strawberry from a paper plate and grunted, eyes fixed on moving hands and faces. The owner tugged the leash, which had slackened around his wrist. Daniel stepped a little closer, maybe 2 feet forward, to avoid another person's shoulder in his frame. The chimp wheeled toward the movement. For a beat, everything held still except the wind. The lunge covered the gap in a blur of dark arms and bared teeth. The harness yanked tight, but not before the chimp's hand closed on Daniel's wrist. The phone flew from his grip, skidding across the dirt. The first bite hit his forearm just below the elbow, tearing skin and muscle. Daniel stumbled backward onto the edge of a blanket, trying to pull free. The chimp's grip did not loosen. A second bite tore into the back of his hand. Screams rose from the crowd. The chimp dragged Daniel down, weight pinning him on his side. Daniel tried to roll and get his feet under him, but the chimp climbed up his torso and hammered his shoulder with fists. The leash tangled with the owner's legs, causing him to fall. In the scramble, the leash slackened again. The chimp shifted higher, seized Daniel's head with both hands, and bit into his cheek. Blood pooled in the grass, soaking the corner of a blanket and streaking the chimp's face. Attempts to intervene failed in rapid succession. A man kicked at the chimp's hip, but the chimp swung one arm without looking and knocked him off balance. Another tried to shove the animal with a folding chair. The chimp ducked and landed another bite on Daniel's face. The sounds were distinct and awful. Wet impacts of fists, ragged breathing, high-pitched shrieks from the animal, and short grunts from Daniel every time teeth met bone. A woman dragged 2 children backward by their shirts as the owner crawled toward the leash, hands shaking. The attack slowed when the owner managed to loop the leash under the chimp's chest and pull it toward a picnic table leg, creating a brief barrier. The chimp released, then lunged again, tearing at Daniel's face and arms before finally losing strength. Daniel's movements weakened. He tried to lift an arm, but another bite to the wrist broke a bone with a sharp crack. Bystanders threw bottles and tried to shield him with a trash can lid, but nothing worked. Emergency calls went out within seconds, yet the rural location delayed help. By the time deputies arrived, the shouting had stopped. The chimp sat trembling near the overturned table, the leash twisted tight around its torso. Daniel lay a few feet away, motionless on the trampled grass, and the chimp was sedated and lifted into a transport cage. By dusk, only tire tracks and a few torn paper plates remained. The river kept moving, slow and steady, carrying away the sounds that had filled the clearing hours earlier. One attack had scattered a few dozen people beside a river. The next would unfold in a television studio, where there was no escape from the cameras. It was September 14th, 2018, in Los Angeles, California. The morning sun cut across the lot of a small, independent production studio, tucked between warehouses and sound stages. Crew members wheeled carts of lighting equipment into place while cameras were arranged around a staged living room set. The segment was meant to be simple, an animal demonstration for a daytime talk show, filmed by a local affiliate. The chimpanzee brought in for the shoot had been trained for years, but the pressure of lights, heat, and dozens of unfamiliar people in close quarters would prove too much. Kevin Harris, 41, was an experienced exotic animal trainer who'd spent 2 decades working small contracts across the state. He'd built his career on patience and consistency, teaching wild species to tolerate human environments through gradual conditioning. The jobs were steady, but not glamorous. School assemblies, local commercials, and small TV projects. This appearance was just another paycheck and a chance to promote his business. The chimp, a 13-year-old named Mike, had worked with Kevin since infancy. At 125 pounds, Mike was fully mature, strong, intelligent, and unpredictable when stressed. Kevin often said the animal knew the rhythm of production life, that he could stay calm under noise and movement. But handlers familiar with chimps knew the truth. Adulthood changes everything. Males that once tolerated crowds often grew volatile once dominance instincts sharpened with age. The set itself was modest, a sofa, coffee table, and painted backdrop beneath a grid of hot studio lamps. Crew members adjusted wiring and sound booms while the host reviewed her lines. Mike sat on a low stool beside Kevin, wearing only a light collar and leash. He shifted constantly, tugging at the strap and scanning the unfamiliar faces. Before cameras rolled, an animal safety coordinator, a consultant required for shoots involving live animals, suggested delaying the segment. Mike was showing stress behaviors, pacing, baring teeth, and tugging sharply on the lead. But the director insisted they proceed. The schedule was tight, and sunlight from the windows was already shifting. Kevin reassured everyone it was fine, offering Mike small pieces of banana to settle him. The tension seemed to fade, at least for the moment. As recording began, the room brightened under the lamps. The host smiled for the opening shot, reading lines about wildlife awareness. Kevin guided Mike closer, cueing him to wave, a trick they'd rehearsed countless times. For a few seconds, everything worked. Then the boom microphone dipped low, casting a shadow that swept across Mike's face. His posture changed instantly, shoulders hunched, lips curled. A low pant hoot echoed off the walls. Kevin turned toward him, voice low, reaching out to calm him. That brief touch broke the balance. The chimp lunged sideways. The leash snapped tight as Kevin fell backward, the stool clattering across the floor. Mike's hands came down in rapid strikes, fists hammering Kevin's chest. The room filled with noise, shouts, hoots, the crash of equipment tipping over. A sound technician stumbled into a light stand. Someone yelled to cut the power. Kevin tried to shield his face, but Mike's jaws locked onto his arm just below the elbow. The bite tore muscle and tendons clean through. Blood sprayed across the carpet as Kevin twisted, trying to free himself. The chimp released and struck again. Another bite to the shoulder, another blow with his fists. The host ran off set. Crew members screamed for security. One man swung a tripod to break the attack, but Mike dodged, gripping Kevin's shirt and dragging him toward the wall. The impact cracked one of the camera housings. The chimp's shrieks grew higher, rhythmic and mechanical, each sound matched to a strike or bite. Kevin's movements slowed. His left arm hung limp. A second crew member threw a fire extinguisher. The spray clouded the air, coating the floor in white dust. Mike released for a moment, then turned toward the noise, baring teeth streaked with red. Security burst in, one man carrying another extinguisher, another holding a collapsible baton. The first blast of powder hit Mike square in the chest. He reared back. The second spray pushed him farther away from Kevin, who lay motionless on the floor. Animal control officers arrived within minutes, summoned by the studio's emergency call. They tranquilized Mike on sight, the dart striking his shoulder as he bared his teeth. He staggered briefly before collapsing beside the toppled couch, eyes fluttering. Kevin survived, but barely. Paramedics stabilized him before rushing him to a trauma center. Surgeons later documented dozens of puncture wounds, a shattered forearm, and severe facial injuries. He lost part of his arm and most of the muscle tissue on one side of his face. The production shut down indefinitely. The footage was never aired. In the aftermath, investigators cited lapses in protocol and disregard for the safety consultant's warning. For Kevin, the lesson came at an unbearable cost, one he would spend the rest of his life recovering from. What began in Los Angeles, bright lights and careful training, still couldn't contain a chimpanzee once instinct took over. Far from the cameras, in the forests of Uganda, there were no barriers or handlers at all. There, the same wild strength waited on its own ground, where one encounter would end a traveler's life. It was October 9th, 2019, along the Kampala-Fort Portal Highway in western Uganda. The two-lane road curved through steep, forested hillsides, with trucks grinding gears uphill and motorbikes weaving past them. The road was a lifeline between towns, but for wildlife whose habitat had been divided by asphalt, it had become a dangerous crossing. Martin Blake was a 48-year-old American wildlife photographer traveling alone. He had spent 2 weeks documenting primates in East Africa and wanted one last series of images before flying home. Known for chasing difficult shots, he often left marked trails to capture animals in unusual settings. That morning, he drove west out of Fort Portal and stopped where the highway cut clean through forest slopes. He had heard stories of chimpanzees appearing at roadside clearings and hoped to photograph one against the backdrop of the mountain road. Martin had experience in the field, having photographed gorillas and monkeys before, but his drive for unique images sometimes pushed him close to risk. He parked in a gravel turnout near a bend, slung his camera over his shoulder, and began walking along the shoulder. A passing motorbike rider shouted at him in the local language, gesturing toward the trees, but Martin only waved back and kept moving. To him, the danger seemed less about animals and more about trucks speeding around blind corners. The highway cut sharply through green ridges, with walls of vegetation pressing close to the road. Traffic passed in bursts, leaving long stretches of silence except for the forest's background noise. On one side, a red dirt slope rose nearly 20 feet, with vines draping down. On the other hand, trees leaned low over a drop into dense undergrowth. It was along these margins that chimpanzees sometimes appeared. They could climb easily across embankments or descend into the ditches that lined the road. In their shrinking habitat, the edge of the asphalt became another boundary to patrol. When startled or challenged, aggression was their first response. Rangers at Kabale's visitor center often told tourists to stay inside vehicles when driving the forest roads. Truck drivers reported occasional sightings of chimps near bends where fruit trees grew close to the highway. Locals avoided walking alone along that stretch, especially in the morning when animals were most active. Martin had been told as much at his lodge the night before. He dismissed it, reasoning that he had worked safely around gorillas under stricter conditions. A few minutes into his walk, Martin saw movement on the slope above. A large male chimpanzee emerged from the vines, pausing at the edge of the slope. Behind him, 2 smaller chimps lingered in the plants. Martin raised his camera, crouching low at the shoulder for a clear angle. A truck roared past, startling the animals. The 2 younger chimps retreated into cover, but the male stood his ground, hooting sharply. Martin kept clicking, zooming in for a close shot. He stepped forward into the lane, unaware that the chimp had begun to climb down toward him. The descent took only seconds. The chimp dropped onto the asphalt with a heavy thud, closing the gap on all fours. Martin lowered the camera just as the animal charged, dark arms swinging with sudden speed. The first impact knocked him backward into the gravel, his camera skidding across the pavement. The chimp seized his left arm and dragged him toward the edge of the road. Martin tried to brace with his feet, but the strength difference was overwhelming. The first bite clamped onto his forearm, tearing skin and muscle. A passing motorbike braked hard, the rider shouting as he watched. Martin screamed and kicked, but the chimp straddled his chest and struck his head with fists. Another bite tore into his shoulder. Blood pooled quickly on the gravel shoulder, running into the ditch. The younger chimps appeared briefly from the tree line, hooting and circling, before retreating again. The male remained fixed on Martin, pulling at his clothes and biting again, this time at his ear and jaw. Witnesses tried to intervene. The motorbike rider threw stones from the roadside, but the chimp barely flinched. A truck slowed, horn blaring, startling the animal just long enough for Martin to roll weakly onto his side. The chimp dragged him back and sank its teeth into his thigh, shaking violently. The sounds were raw. The rasp of Martin's strained breathing, the chimp's screeches, the crunch of gravel as the struggle shifted back and forth. The assault lasted only a few minutes, though to the witnesses it felt far longer, before another vehicle stopped and locals rushed forward, shouting and waving sticks. The chimp released and retreated toward the slope, disappearing into the vines with blood on its face and hands. Martin lay motionless on the roadside, his clothes torn and soaked. Drivers flagged down a passing truck, and Martin was lifted onto the flatbed using a blanket. With no ambulance nearby, locals tried to keep pressure on his wounds as the truck sped toward Fort Portal. He lost consciousness within minutes. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, he had no pulse. Doctors at the hospital confirmed he was dead on arrival. His camera bag held memory cards with his last images: the forest edge, the red dirt slope, and one blurred frame of the chimp stepping from the vines. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.